Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the break, and I'm hoping most of you had some coffee, so you'll be buzzing from the caffeine, and my talk will probably sound better than it actually is. But my talk's more on the softer side of things, so I'm not going to really stress your brains out too much, but it should hopefully still be valuable. So let's get right into it. My name is Tanaka Mutakwa. I'm a development line manager at Prodigy Finance. I'll get more into that soon. A couple of overexcited colleagues. Don't invite them next year. So just to start, normally at the first few slides, the first slide from a conference speaker, they'll either put a picture of their dog or their cat or their children. And as I was preparing these slides, I realized I don't have any pets and I don't have any children yet. So I found a picture of myself when I was a child, and I decided to use that instead. And as I've been preparing for the talk over the last few weeks, I've obviously seen the slide quite often, and I started doing a little bit of analysis on it. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, who the hell designed such a terrible school uniform? I'm glad I only went to that school for like 4 years, and I was still so young that I didn't have any sense of fashion. If you try go deeper into analysis, right behind me at the bottom, there's a couple of beers there. I promise I hadn't started drinking at that age, but it probably makes sense that I do enjoy beer now. I probably inherited that from my parents. And we can keep going further, and you can probably ask me why there's maize planted in our backyard, but that's something we'll talk about after the conference, quite common where I come from. So a little bit about me. I've only worked at 2 companies in my career. Right after university, I worked at Allen Gray. I spent 4 years there working in the web team, working with C# and ASP.NET. Allen Gray is an investment management company. People give them their money and they try grow it, hopefully to get a better return. And after those 4 years, I was sort of done with taking people's money and decided to move to a place where we give away money. So I moved to Prodigy Finance, and I've been working there for just over 4 years now. We basically give out student loans to international students who are going to study abroad at the top schools across the world. So a typical example would be a South African that gets a place at Oxford and needs funding to go do their MBA. We would be able to give that funding to them. And we're also one of the fintech companies with their software team, mostly based in Cape Town. And here, in my first 3 years at Prodigy, I worked as a full-on software engineer, and beginning of last year, I started working as a development line manager, as I mentioned. And what that means is my role is split into some time spent on the software engineering side, so just building software, and then the other part of my time is spent managing, at the moment, 5 other engineers in our team. So they report into me, and I help them with growing their careers and just making sure they're happy at the company and working along with the rest of the technology leadership team at Prodigy. Cool. So there's probably never been a better time to be a software engineer than right now. Most companies depend on technology or require technology to run their daily business processes, or actually the whole business is based on technology. Software tools are progressing and moving forward. I mean, there's a new JavaScript framework almost every day. And as we saw from an earlier talk, Ruby has moved so far ahead. That's an example of another language that's moved forward. So companies are always looking at getting up to the latest technologies. And as a result of this, it means the people who actually write the software are in high demand. This is across the world. And when you look at the normal sort of graph of demand and supply, when it comes to software engineers, it doesn't really work out to balance in the middle. There's actually more of a demand for engineers than the supply is. And we know that is quite evident in Cape Town. We've heard how many people have said that they're hiring during their talk. I don't know if this is the right time to say we are also hiring, but I'll mention it now. And further evidence to this is how often we get contacted by LinkedIn recruiters looking for software engineers. I think almost every week I get 3 messages from a recruiter saying, this is the best company to work at in Cape Town. We're looking for a rockstar engineer like you, and we've discovered that you're probably the perfect fit for that role. could we meet up for a chinwag or coffee or dinner or something? And some of them are even as extreme as that same message you end up finding in your Facebook inbox and somehow on WhatsApp. I don't know how they get the details. But all this is telling us that we're essentially in a space where developers are really required at the moment. There's a high demand for them, and software engineering as a skill has become one of the core skills we need. But this wasn't always the case. So especially, like in Africa and stuff, if you go back like 10, 15 years ago, other sort of industries were sort of where you were directed to go to when you were studying. So I've got a few stories that illustrate this. I grew up in Zimbabwe. I went to high school there. And typically, if you're in high school in Zimbabwe, in your first few years, you do a whole lot of subjects that cover like everything from sciences to business and social stuff and everything. And when you're around 16, you write what are called ordinary level exams. And based on your results from those exams, you get to choose 3 subjects that you specialize in for what is called advanced level, which is the edge of high school when you finish off. So you start specializing in high school, actually deciding where you want to take your career. And typically the people who do well in the ordinary level exams, like the A-star students, would go and do science subjects. That was sort of the core. The main combination that was known was maths, physics, and chemistry. And people who sort of did that were seen to go change the world, basically. They'll become either doctors, pilots, architects, or civil engineers. And when I did my O-level exams, ordinary level exams, I did pretty well. And when I came back to the school, I came back and said, I'm going to do maths, computer science, and business studies. And I remember this pretty well. Like one of the top science teachers, when I told them that was my combination of subjects, it's something I'll never forget, because when you're so young, like something that hard hits you. So they looked at me and they said, what a waste of a brain. And at that point I was thinking, am I choosing the wrong thing? Yeah, because obviously I had chosen computer science mainly because I enjoyed it and I was good at it. But you're so young and you're looking at an adult telling you you're wasting your brain and you're thinking, oh, maybe they've got something here. But I'm still glad that like my sort of waste of a brain kind of has led to software engineering, which is now a highly demanded skill across the world. And then another example is when I was done with my advanced level exams, which is the specialization, and I was applying to come study at University of Cape Town. I chose computer science again as my first option. And I remember my dad asking me multiple times, are you sure you want to go study computer science? And I said yes. And I figured why he kept asking me, like some of his friends, that he's been chatting to some of his friends and they kept telling him, you know what, this guy, you should go study accounting and become a chartered accountant, or you should go do engineering, become a civil engineer. And when he's made all his money in that industry, he can then go play around in this IT thing he's talking about. So again, like tech at that time was sort of seen as this thing where you just go and like play around, not really seen as the core career to go for. And if we bring the example a bit closer to home here in Cape Town, if you asked a sort of software engineer, if you met them at a bar or like at a conference, like 10 or maybe like 12 years ago, so this is not a full representation of all the companies that have ever been in Cape Town, but just like sort of gives an idea of what I'm talking about. So if you asked an engineer back then, 12 years ago, so they'll tell you either they worked at a corporate, so sort of the top left companies, or they worked at a software house, so sort of the top right companies. And that was sort of mostly it. And actually the interesting thing is a lot of the software houses were actually building software for the corporates on the left there. So that was mostly the industry. It was like just the corporates, they had figured out they needed software to continue, and then the software houses were basically building software for them. Then the guys who've got obviously that e-commerce bookstore decided we need to get into technology and got a bit clever, and then they came and set up an office in Cape Town, and that sort of triggered recruitment and tech recruitment wars, because they started pulling people from all these companies and hiring developers, and Cape Town software engineer demand increased. And you fast forward a few years later, after the term fintech was coined, then a whole set of fintech companies started forming in and around Cape Town. So some guys decided that you don't need a bank card at all, you can just move with your phone and make payments. And then other guys decided that actually the current bank payment machines are too big, so you need a small card reader, and they started rolling out small, cheaper card readers across Cape Town. And this is not a full representation of all the companies. There's a lot more. I mean, you can add Luno here. There's also Sweep South, which is also another example. But it just goes to show how much like the tech scene has grown in and around Cape Town. and how much all these companies need engineers and are hiring for engineers, and how many opportunities developers have to just go around and look for jobs everywhere. And then things went full circle because eventually these guys figured out that there's so many companies that need developers, and developers are also looking for jobs, so they created a platform that obviously allows these two to link up and you can get a job through them. And I was chatting at the speakers dinner 2 days ago to some guys who work at OfficeN, and they mentioned that there are about 900 companies hiring off of OfficeN. So again, that goes to show how much companies are looking for people and are hiring. So my talk today is about onboarding for developers, and in leading up to this, I've been talking mostly about how software engineering has grown and how people are hiring intensely and looking for people, which is important. And I think the reason we do that actually is so that when a developer joins your company, they're actually valuable. They provide some value, and ideally you want them to provide value as quickly as possible, and you want them to provide value over the long term. So we often focus on, can I recruit, can I get people in? But then some places, obviously, once someone's joined, it's almost like, hey, figure it out, we need to get going. But if we actually then provide the right platform for once we've hired someone, for them to be successful, how do we make them successful as fast as possible and for the long term, then we're ensuring that the efforts we're spending in hiring actually are useful for us. And these are two sort of quotes I found on the internet. I don't know how legitimate they are. I could have made them more legitimate by saying research has stated that the cost of replacing a recently hired employee is 30 to 50% of their salary. It's funny how, like, if you place like that research has in front of something, it can sound more legitimate. So whether they're correct or not, what we are all certain of, and we all never argue about, is if you spend time trying to hire someone and they join your company, if they end up leaving in the first few months of joining, or if they end up never being productive at your company, then it's a complete waste of time, money, and reputation for the company. So it's still important that once someone has joined, we make sure to give them the right, correct onboarding to make them successful. What we definitely don't want is an engineer looking like that in their first week at working at your company. The funny thing about this pic is it's actually one of the developers I work with now. I took this photo 4 years ago. So while it was perfect for talking about what you don't want someone to look like, this guy was probably onboarded correctly because he's still working with us today. So cool. So when I was looking at how do we onboard people properly, what I considered was when I was looking at it, I was considered what would make a successful software engineer? What are the things I look at when I'm thinking this is a perfect sort of software engineer? And I ended up distilling those to three sort of tools. One is tools and technologies, one is domain knowledge, and one is soft skills. And I'm going to drill down into each of them and talk about what they are and how you can sort of provide them once someone has joined your company. So we can quickly start with tools and technologies. And when we talk of tools and technologies, we're talking about things like what languages do you use at your company? So is it Ruby? Is it Python? What frameworks are you working with? Rails, ASP.NET, Django? What sort of architecture do you have? Is it like one whole big monolith application, or is it split into different services? If it is, how do these services communicate between each other? What source control do you use? How's your infrastructure set up? Where are you hosting your code? Is it manual? Is it like automated? What build tools and CI tools do you use to run your tests? And also coding standards and preferred practices. So someone could come from a place where they use the exact same technologies. They could be using Ruby on Rails, and they join your house and you use Ruby on Rails, but then maybe you do things slightly different. You've got ways of coding and stuff that you've agreed on in your place, and you prefer the person to learn and use those. So those are examples of sort of like what you're looking at when you're considering tools and technologies. Now, how do you sort of get someone up to speed, like once they've joined? So one of the first things is in the early days, you want someone to make real changes to the code base, like very early on. Even if the change is like very small, so it could easily be like, hey, change the text on that view, like one word or something. But the idea anyway behind that is if they have to make a change to that small change, they need to check out the code to their machine. That means they're getting to play around with your source control. Once they've changed that text, they need to run the test. So they're seeing how your tests are set up on your code, in your code base. They need to push up the code. It needs to build. They're getting to see how the CI runs the tests. And it needs to be deployed and land to production. So they get to sort of have a feel of how does code actually get to production. So it's really about they get at least a glimpse of how your full workflow works from getting a requirement and getting it into production. Pair programming. So if by default you don't always pair program, which is if you're fully implementing extreme programming practices, you might be pair programming for every change. If you don't, most places don't. Most places will do a mix. Sometimes someone will work by themselves, sometimes they'll pair. But ideally, when someone new is joined, you want them to pair a lot with the people in their team, rotating the team members also. But then that's going to help them because they're going to be working with someone who's sort of confident with the current code base because they've been working on it for a while, and they sort of just get to see how you navigate the code base and get things explained to them as changes are getting made. But they're also getting to know their team members along with that. If you have any onboarding documentation, ideally you want to share it then. So this could be how some people have architecture diagrams of this is our architecture setup. It could be this is how our team currently works. Any useful documentation that your company has or your team has, ideally you want to share it early. Of course, the thing with documentation is it always needs to be up to date. It's also a perfect opportunity to keep it up to date because as the person reads it, they might identify things that are missing, and you want to keep it up to date for the next person who's going to join. And then finally, it's more around so you need, if you can keep a list of prescribed books or video tutorials for someone who's joined without actually knowing the tools or the technologies you use. So example, someone comes in and never used Ruby on Rails, you do Ruby on Rails. What books would you prescribe they start reading and what video tutorials could they look at? People learn differently. Personally, I prefer books, but I know some people prefer videos. And ideally, you want to facilitate this through some sort of training budget that the company provides so the person can buy these books. Or if the books are already like sort of in your office library, they can just borrow them from there. So at this point, you sort of have a new engineer who's joined, who's figured out sort of the technical bits and the tools and technologies. And if you've done really well, this engineer can write like the perfect code for you. But then the perfect code that's written, like when I talk about perfect code, it's code you look at and you're like, oh wow, that code, well structured, well named, it's like tested. But then if that code does not do or does not solve any of the problems the company is trying to sort of address, then it's pretty much useless code. It's just that the person understands how to use the tool, which is the language you're working with, but they also need to understand sort of the business side, which is where the domain knowledge comes in. And when we're talking of domain knowledge, we're talking what does the business actually do? Like what problem does the business solve and why does it exist, this company that this person has joined? What are the company goals at the moment and where are we trying to go? If you can get someone to understand those things, firstly, they understand what problems they're solving with the software they're writing, but also they can also start questioning sometimes when they get requirements that they don't sort of agree with or they feel could be adjusted and made better. But they can also improve the company because if they understand the company, they can suggest things that help the company itself. And this is usually facilitated through some form of induction training. So that could be, depending on your company, because company sizes differ, it could be like another engineer who fully understands the business, explaining it to the person. It could be the product owner on the team fully explaining the whole company picture. And with slightly bigger companies, for example, in our case, we have induction training running once every month for all the new joiners. And in that induction training, different departments will come and like do a presentation on how they work. So it could be marketing, or it could be finance, or it could be the business development team, and they come and explain how they work and where they fit in the full company picture. And the whole idea behind that is software engineering in itself is a lot more than just writing code. You might understand Ruby, you might understand Rails, and you can churn out code, but the reason we do these things is because we're trying to solve real sort of company problems or real world problems. And now you've got a point where you've got the engineer who can write code, as I mentioned earlier, and you've got someone who understands business problems. So they're getting there, but there's still one last component, which is most of us these days work in teams. So we're working with other people. it's rare that you find yourself in a little corner just churning out code by yourself and building things. You're mostly working you're mostly working with teams, and you're mostly working with other people who aren't even engineers. So business people are also coming and working with you. And this is usually blanketed under sort of soft skills, so how you communicate and how you interact with everyone. And around this, what I have is, once someone's sort of settled down in your company, you want to give them the opportunity to lead sort of the team reviews, if you do any, and company-wide technology demos. And the idea behind that is you give them the opportunity to communicate the work they've sort of worked on, give them the confidence, help them with presentation skills. Some people will be really good at them already, but then this still just gives that opportunity. It also increases their visibility. Now other people across the company, if they've got questions and stuff, can go and chat with them. It helps them be able, sometimes as engineers, we're sort of stuck in our sort of technical world, and sometimes we need to bring it a level up and just be able to communicate what we're working on without all that technical jargon and everything. I've dropped team building here, which I think is also important because we're often stuck in like our day-to-day work and like the problems we're solving, but sometimes it's good to just sort of switch off from that and go one level up and just have like a social, something outside of like work, to allow people to actually build relationships and like talk about other things. So like, what do you do? Like, what's your life really about and stuff like that. And team building can be anything. It's up to your team. Some people like have a braai or just have like random drinks after work. Some people actually go for an actual activity. So whether it's a hike or like a hint hunt or anything. But the idea is just like switch off outside of the day-to-day and only thinking about work. And I put pair programming here again because even though I mentioned it on the technical skills growing, because that's like learning the tech bits, as you're pairing with someone, in any case, you're building a relationship with that person because you are communicating and you're chatting and everything. And the last part is sort of on workplace culture, which is every place has got sort of a defined culture they're trying to live up to and they've set. And as the people who already work at that place, the idea is be examples of what that culture should be. Because once someone joins, they're going to follow on that path. So try to be as much as an example of what the culture you've set and the culture you want your company to be in those days when someone's joined and they're watching and following through you. So in summary, like onboarding for developers, in my mind, comes down to allowing the person who's new to be able to write code, to learn about your company, and to also get to know your colleagues. So I joined Prodigy Finance when there were 4 other engineers, and now we are almost approaching 50 engineers. And most of the principles or practices I've mentioned here are things I've seen us use over the years as we've been obviously we've had to onboard all these new people and everything. And it seems to have worked. And I'm sure some of them are things you already know and have been using, but if there's been anything there that you haven't been trying out and everything, I would hope you'd be able to try it out and probably add value to you. I've added my social media details at the end of the talk. I hardly tweet these days. I used to in university. I don't know what happened. I post quite a bit on Instagram, but you probably see a lot of running photos. And I've got a website where I blog, and I blog about anything most of the time. It could be running, could be business, could be tech, up to you. Are there any questions before I announce the winner of the Raspberry Pi? So I think you've almost answered your question there. I think it's a lot about the culture. So, of course, you've got preferred practices and everything that are already set at your place. And if someone new joins, they should be open to ask why we do those things, and we should have answers from when we made the call for that. But the culture should also be open enough to support someone who's got new ideas. So if they've got new ideas, those could potentially become the new preferred practices. So we should be open enough to listen to what someone says, and then we can weigh out whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense to add on. So I think a lot about the sort of developer arrogance and stuff, it is there, and it's like, I want to do things my way, but I think that's a lot to do with the place's culture. And if a culture is open enough and is like, we collaborate here and we move together, then it works. Yeah, so I think, we've had quite a number of people actually, from Prodigy, people who didn't come from Ruby on Rails background. And it's mostly been, as I was saying, so when someone joins, initially would prescribe with them with a code school account with, hey, look at these courses. This is what the last person who came without Ruby on Rails did. And you're free to get these books if you're keen on learning and reading. But also you're getting support from a lot of the people who are in the company who already have Ruby on Rails experience, and they're explaining to you why do things work this way and stuff. Yeah, what I found is if you've been working in another language and everything, unless it's a complete big paradigm shift, but if you came from like ASP.NET MVC and you're moving to Rails, it's more like, oh, okay, I understand similar concepts here. It's just I need to understand the syntax and how things are working. So yeah, so it's a lot of support from the people who you're working with, but then you need to go in and like obviously do the tutorials, read the books, and move with that. Yeah. Cool. Okay, cool. So if the winner is not here, anyone else from their company, if they're here, you can pick it up for them. Else we'll email them and they'll come collect. This would be where the drum roll is. Apparently the winner wants to use it for an arcade machine, and the winner is Jacques Grobler. Okay, it's not here. Okay, cool. Cool. Thank you.